All right, welcome to fail or not to fail. That is the data factory question. I'd like to start by posing a question that inspired this talk. When an activity in a data factory pipeline fails, does the entire pipeline fail? Well, it depends. And my it depends answer may have hinted that I am indeed a consultant. My name is Megan. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I work for Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting doing data integration and analytics work. Feel free to find me on Twitter or my blog. I've been using Data Factory for a while, several years now, back since like 2016, which was the V1 days, but we won't talk about that because we still have bad memories. Now that you know a little bit about me, let's cover a little bit about Data Factory to make sure we've got the basics down. Data Factory is a cloud-based data orchestration, integration, and transformation tool. Inside a Data Factory are pipelines, which are a logical grouping of activities that act as the unit of execution. Pipelines are executed by triggers, and these triggers can be manual, scheduled, tumbling time window, or event-based. And within each pipeline are one or more activities. This is where the work actually happens. And these activities do things like copy data from one database to another. They set a variable or call a REST API. Activities can be standalone, or they can have dependencies on each other. Before we get into too much more detail, we need to note that activity dependencies have conditions. We can make a subsequent activity execute only if the previous activity is executed successfully, which is probably the most common use of dependency conditions. But we can also configure that activity to only execute if the previous activity failed, or if it completed, meaning an attempt was made and the outcome was success or failure. Or we can set an activity to run only if the previous activity was skipped. And we should also note that activity dependencies are a logical AND. So if I have activities A and B with success paths to C, activity C only executes if both activity A and B succeed. So let's say I have activities A and B again, but they each have a failure path to C. Activity C only executes if both activity A and B fail. So if activity A succeeds and activity B fails, activity C is skipped. So let's start digging into my question about whether an activity failure means pipeline failure. There are two main scenarios where an activity can fail, but the pipeline succeeds. So first, if the number of retries allowed on an activity is greater than 0, and the first attempt fails, but a subsequent attempt succeeds, you would see the original activity failure, but the pipeline would show success. Second, if you have a try-catch pattern where an earlier activity fails and it has a failure or completion path, but no success path, the pipeline would show success. This is a bit different from other ETL tools that you may have used, so this catches several people. I'll spend what's left of my time going over these two situations. So for activity retries, we can set the number of retries allowed on each activity, with the exception of execute pipeline activities. If we have it set to a number greater than 0, Data Factory will try the activity again, and if it fails the first time, and then it'll keep trying until it succeeds or hits that retry limit that we have defined in the activity settings. Allowing retries can be really helpful if you have transient errors or connectivity issues. So it's pretty common to set that. So in my example, we see here, I have a lookup activity that retrieves data from a file in blob storage. But the first time Data Factory attempted the lookup, the file it tried to connect to was not available. I had retries set to 2, so it waited a few minutes and tried again, and the second time was successful. So when we look at that, in the Monitor and Manage app, this is what we would see from that execution. Here we see my lookup activity was executed twice. That first try failed, but it tried again and the second attempt succeeded. And if we look at the pipeline runs, it will show that the pipeline succeeded. So although it didn't work the first time, the pipeline did eventually successfully run. And that's the first situation where an activity can fail, but the pipeline succeeds. So let's take a look at how these activity dependency conditions combine with the activity status to affect the overall pipeline status. I've grouped these into 4 categories to help make it easier to understand. First, when the first activity in the pipeline succeeds and all other activities either succeed or are skipped, the pipeline will show success. So if you have activity 1 with a success path to activity 2 and both activities succeed, the pipeline reports success. But what if we change that dependency to a failure condition? Activity 1 succeeds, activity 2 is skipped, and the pipeline reports success. Now, if we make it maybe more realistic by adding another activity, as long as activity 1 succeeds and activity 2 and 3 either succeed or are skipped, our pipeline will report success. So now let's look at something that may not be as intuitive. Here are 3 cases where activity 1 fails, but the pipeline succeeds. The first is what I mentioned earlier with the retries. The next example has activity 1 failing and then a failure path to activity 2, which succeeds. This is called a try-catch pattern when you look it up in Microsoft Docs. In this case, we successfully caught that activity 1 failure, so the pipeline reports success. And if we change the condition from failure to completion, the same thing happens. Now let's say activity 1 fails and it's the only activity. The pipeline will, of course, report failure. If we add activity 2 with a success constraint and then activity 1 fails, activity 2 is skipped because of that, and the pipeline will fail. Here's where this gets a little tricky. What if we take that try-catch pattern from earlier, but we add a success path for a third activity? So if we look at the third one down on the right, now activity 1 fails, activity 2 is skipped, and the failure path leads to activity 3, which executes successfully. This time, though, the pipeline fails. So as soon as we add that success path, that changes the pipeline outcome. So this time we'll focus on the activities at the end of the pipeline. In a pipeline with 2 activities with a dependency on the first activity, if activity 2 fails, regardless of the dependency condition on activity 1, the pipeline will fail. If any activity at the end of the pipeline fails, basically the pipeline will fail. So if we summarize all that, the pipeline will fail when an activity with no dependencies fails, or when an activity fails and has a success path. The pipeline succeeds when either all activities succeed or are skipped. And the pipeline also succeeds when we have that try-catch pattern, where there's a failure or a completion path and no success path. So why does this matter? Well, it's a big deal when you're monitoring things. Understand what this means. If you've used a try-catch pattern and you want to know anytime something fails, you can't just monitor your pipeline status. You need to look at the activity status as well. If you don't want to know if an activity failed and retried and was successful the second time, then don't create an alert to bother you anytime there is an activity failure. When we use the Monitor and Manage app or Azure Monitor, we can measure at either the pipeline or the activity level. So you'll have to decide what alerts are most appropriate. And maybe you really do want to know when something fails due to a transient connectivity issue, but you've used the try-catch pattern for error handling. So just keep this in mind as you build your pipelines and set up monitoring. And that's my time. I hope you enjoyed this quick talk. I do have a document version of this that I just explained today, so you can download that as well as read the blog post. Feel free to follow me on Twitter or hit up my blog or my company website. Thank you very much.